for the Badger Institute Symposium Series, Florida's Bipartisan Data Law, a Model for Wisconsin. My name is Julie Grace, and I am a policy analyst in the Badger Institute Center for Opportunity. I will be moderating today's discussion. We are also joined by Speaker Chris Sprowls, Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives, and Chelsea Murphy, Florida's State Director for Right on Crime. If you are not familiar with us at the Badger Institute, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank guided by the belief that free markets, limited government, and private initiative are key to our democratic way of life. We are based in Milwaukee, but we research and write on issues that impact the entire state of Wisconsin, including criminal justice, occupational licensing, taxes, transportation, federalism. More information on our work can be found on our website, badgerinstitute.org. So as I mentioned, today's event is part of our symposium series, where we really look to experts from across the country to discuss issues and topics that are relevant to the state of Wisconsin. Today, we'll be discussing the importance of criminal justice data and the need for better data in the state. In recent years, the Badger Institute has researched on issues like expungement, revocation, community supervision, and other criminal justice topics. And we found that our state lacks very basic measures on our criminal justice system. And we believe that obtaining better data on our system is needed so that we know how our tax dollars are being spent and where reform might be needed. So our guests here today will discuss a Criminal Justice Data and Transparency Act that they helped pass in Florida in 2018. The bill is really unlike any other data bill in the country. It's very substantive and passed in almost, not only bipartisan, but almost, I think, unanimously in the Florida House and Senate. So they're here to share with us what that bill does, how it passed, and as well to answer any questions that any of us might have. So first, I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers before we move to the Q&A portion. So Chelsea Murphy, as I mentioned, is the Right on Crime State Director in Florida. She has been immersed in Florida politics for the past decade and advocated on behalf of various clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies, trade associations, nonprofits, local government. Specific to justice reform, she represented the largest and oldest private provider for reentry services in the state of Florida. She also helped start 2 smart justice coalitions, and she's represented a variety of mental and behavioral health stakeholders. She lives in Tallahassee with her husband and 2 children. As I mentioned, we also have Speaker Chris Sprowls here with us today. He is a Republican legislator, attorney, and Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. He assumed the presiding officer in November of 2020. At only 30 years old, Sprowls was first elected to represent Florida House District 65. He was reelected in 2016, 18, and 20. Before that, he spent 7 years as an assistant state attorney for Florida's 6th Judicial Circuit, where he acted as a gang and homicide prosecutor. Sprowls provided a voice for victims and worked tirelessly to provide them the justice that they deserve in that role. He applied his legal experience to his work as a state representative by sponsoring legislation to improve the criminal justice system through data transparency, end surprise medical billing, enhance DNA privacy, and significantly expand school choice in Florida. Sprowls is married to his wife, Shannon, and they have 2 boys, Prescott and Conrad. So thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I will start by asking our guests some questions. And then after that, we will turn to audience questions. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A chat, and then I will read through those at the end, and hopefully we can get to, as many as possible. So let's get started. And I'm just going to start with you, Speaker Sprowls, with a very basic question. Can you just give us all an overview on what the Criminal Justice Transparency Initiative is in Florida, and what led you to conclude that it was needed?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Julie. It's great to be with you and Chelsea and the folks in the Badger Institute and the folks who are on the call today. I appreciate all the work you're doing for free markets and liberty, both in your state and across the nation. So, we came to this point, several years ago where, like most legislatures throughout the country, like the federal government, having conversations about criminal justice system, what works, what doesn't work, what's in the best interest of keeping crime low, best interest of taxpayers, best interest of public safety. And what I found as somebody who was a prosecutor, was intimately familiar with the criminal justice system from a day-to-day basis, was it was shockingly difficult for me to get the kind of data and information that I wanted about the criminal justice system. And several years ago when I chaired the Judiciary Committee, we went about this exercise to get all these things. And what we found was a totally disjointed, fragmented system of data that was spread across the state. Now, the good news is there was lots of it. The bad news was it was totally unusable in any kind of fashion because it was so fragmented and siloed. And we said to ourselves, we're having these really important conversations about public safety, and yet we can't be truly informed about what the data is. So we wanted to figure out, how do we become a state that has the most robust collection and public reporting of criminal justice data anywhere in America, so that whether it's in the halls of the legislature, we have public policy conversations, whether it's advocates like Chelsea who are doing research on a regular basis about criminal justice, whether it's researchers in the university context, that they have access to real-time data and can help inform that conversation. The reality is that when somebody plays music, sometimes it sounds differently. But we should all have the same notes on the same sheet of paper to start with. And that was the goal through the Criminal Justice Data Transparency Bill.
Chelsea, can you first of all just tell us, for those who aren't familiar, what Right on Crime is and why you were involved in pushing for this legislation?
Sure. So Right on Crime, we're actually housed under the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So we're based out of Austin, Texas, but we have several different state directors across the state and some in DC as well. But really, we're kind of a conservative voice for criminal justice. Although we are nonpartisan, I think that we're really about making sure that our tax dollars are being used properly. We're keeping folks safe, but also making sure that folks are getting back to their families, more importantly. It's been a pleasure to see Speaker Sprowls craft this baby. This was his all of his hard work, and he really did a thorough job of trying to get all of this together. And he's absolutely right. There was so much data everywhere. And at the end of the day, there's some things that we can do and we can assess that need to be done, but we need to see data. We need to see certain things. Some we have, some we don't. And it's a great opportunity for legislators to be able to look at something, like you said, just pen to paper.
Mm-hmm. And Speaker, you mentioned a really great analogy on the notes and the music. Another part of this bill, in addition to requiring the state to report more data, was establishing definitions on a whole variety of criminal justice terms like recidivism, revocation. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that aspect of the bill and why was that included?
Yeah, and I know a lot of people on the call are very educated on the criminal justice system, but kind of a basic thing. We talk about recidivism all the time, right? We helped found the first veterans treatment court where I'm from in Pinellas County, anywhere in the state of Florida. And the whole idea was to cut down on, recidivism rates. But in the state, when we talked about recidivism, what we really meant, what the definition really meant, and the only thing we collected data on is, does that person go back to prison? So if they'd gone to county jail 100 times, that didn't count as recidivism unless they ended up back at the Department of Corrections. That's a problem. So, part of this was, searching the state, and what we found is, violations of probation, pretrial interventions, treatment courts, all of these things had different definitions depending on what part of the state you were in. So to your point, Julie, what we had to do is kind of create what I think the data people call a data catalog, to say, all right, here are the terms and here's what they mean. So whether it's a clerk's office in a county or a sheriff or a state attorney, when you are transmitting data to, in this case, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the central hub where all of this data goes, when you send us data, this is what those terms mean, so that we're truly collecting, apples and apples across the state. So that was a far more, I think, difficult process than I ever could have imagined when we did the bill. And part of that is just not having a background in the technical aspects of data collection. But there were, getting comments from all the stakeholders on each single definition to make sure that it made sense, to make sure that everyone could comply. And that was a very, very difficult process, as well as getting them to kind of shift from whatever definition that they had. I think the vast majority of them now have shifted their definitions to meet the statutory definition for data collection. So, those of you who are considering kind of doing this, that is something that is going to take some time. And to the extent that maybe you could lean in on that on the front end, maybe save yourself some time on the back end.
That's something that we see in Wisconsin as well, especially with the recidivism definition. I believe that we define it as you previously did with returning back to a prison. Chelsea, you were influential in kind of the coalition that came together to pass this bill. What other groups did you work with? What did that coalition look like? Can you speak about that a little bit?
Sure. We had a bunch of different folks, and I had actually I believe I just started with Right on Crime too. So I was starting to get to know some of the players that were in there. And Americans for Prosperity was very, very helpful. James Madison Institute, FAM was helpful. And so we kind of all realized that, we need to we have to help, future Speaker D there and now Speaker, but we want to help him. And also we want this information. And it's interesting. You have folks that, think that their information is going to prove one side and the other is going to prove the other. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Data is data, and we can't argue that. And so I think that it was easy to get a lot of other folks, both on the right and left, behind this.
Yeah. And Julie, if it's okay, Julie, I'll add some to that because Chelsea was great during that process. I mean, in fact, I very much recall her standing very close to right behind me when we were announcing this bill, right outside here in the rotunda in the Capitol. And there's a bunch of groups. One of them was Measures for Justice as well, and they played an integral role in really the technical stuff that we would have had no institutional knowledge of at all. And what we did was I had actually had a state attorney who I think highly of, who had reached out to me and told me about the work that was happening at Measures for Justice. I reached out to Amy Bach, the head of that organization, and had great conversations with her, as well as Chelsea, as well as AFP, who was also extremely helpful in that connection. And what we asked them was, look, you're doing this across the country, where you're getting, 24 data elements out of the state or 40 data elements out of the state. If you could develop your dream scenario where you had the data, what would that dream scenario be? And we got that information from them, and that is the bill that we pursued in Florida. And with the idea being that we wanted to start with the aspirational goal, achieve it, and then as Measures for Justice was fond of telling me at the time, data begets data. As soon as we get some, we realize we need more, and that's the reason that we put data fellows into various counties to make sure that as we go along and collect data, we figure out which data we're missing, and we continue to evolve and add to it.
I don't know how that even. I talked to Gypsy yesterday. I wanted to check in, and I lit that. Shame on me. You're absolutely. They're wonderful, wonderful folks over there, and really kind of helped craft this. So that's their baby too. So I don't know how I slipped that one. Sorry.
I should have also mentioned at the beginning of this call, we have a really great group of people here today, including some folks in Measures for Justice, I believe. Some people from the State Department of Corrections here in Wisconsin and legislative offices. So a lot of people, I think, who are interested in hearing what both of you have to say. Speaker Sprowls, I have a question for you. It seemed like prior to this legislation, Florida's criminal justice system, or the data that was compiled, was kind of fragmented, between the courts, the Department of Corrections, the jails, and some was public and some was not. How did you kind of get all of those agencies to work together or get on the same page? I can't imagine that was an easy task, but once again, Wisconsin has a similar system right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. They deserve a lot of praise. I mean, we went to them in the very beginning and said, look, this is gonna hurt from a work standpoint. We realize that this is gonna be a lot of work for clerks of the court and for the sheriffs, the state attorneys. And by the way, we really didn't give them any additional money to do this. So, they had to do this mostly absorbed within their existing resources. And they have done a fantastic job. I think the first part of it is getting them to buy into the vision. Getting them to understand, hey, listen, you want this as much as we do. If you're a sheriff, if you're a state attorney, if you're involved in this space, you want as much information in criminal justice is king. And, and when, you have that information, it arms you to do a better job, to keep your community safe, to know if there's problems, if there's mistakes that are being made that are inadvertent, you get to know what those mistakes are and fix them. So it was, getting them to buy into their vision. And when Chelsea and I stood there with a group of others and announced this bill, we had state attorneys, we had sheriffs, we had clerks of the court, we had members of the judicial branch. So they really did buy in a big, big way. And to credit to those folks, they were ready to pump their data to the hub far before the hub was ready to receive it. So they were ready and willing to engage and did so in a really, really big way.
That's encouraging and great to hear. Chelsea, how do you hope to use the data once it's published, or is there anything that Right on Crime is especially interested in determining?
I think there's several different aspects to it. I think that we want to see one, like where's our problem area? What's increasing? What's that issue we need to also address? And we also want to make sure that we're reforming the right laws if needed. But another thing is, for example, we have several different counties. We've got 67 counties, and some counties have pretrial, some don't, pretrial release. And so that's an interesting thing just to see how those numbers work. And I think a lot of it is just taking a holistic approach of looking at everything, being able to decide where the most needed, whether it's fines in the clerk's office, to what kind of issues are going on. And so I think that while we do hear about a lot of aches and pains from various departments, I think that it'll be really helpful to have that all in one space. So I think that if y'all can try and replicate that too, I think that it would just be great to have that even all across the country. So that way we're actually being able to see what our issues are.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a ton of questions pouring in. I just have 1 to 2 more I want to ask you, Speaker. If there was a Wisconsin legislator who was interested in passing a similar bill in Wisconsin, what would you tell them? Any advice?
I would say, use our bill as a starting point. I really do think it's a great product. What I would say to you, though, is, because I think you'll be able to buy in the stakeholders and the members behind this vision. So what I would think about is implementation. Right? I always say this to members, passing the bill seems like the hardest part. It's really not. It's implementing the vision that you had. And, this is a really big project, and it has never been done anywhere in America. And it has been hard. It has been a lot harder than I thought it would be. It has been a lot slower than I wanted it to be. I can tell you patience is a virtue. It's not one I think I have a lot of. But, so it's been very difficult to get, I think, the agency that, was responsible for this to do it on the timetable that I had anticipated and that I wanted, and that was originally contemplated in the bill. I think we're making huge strides, and I think it's going to be fantastic. But I would think about, are there ways on the implementation side to make sure that this moves along a lot faster? So, maybe run parallel tracks, while you're introducing the bill, while you're moving the bill, get the stakeholders and give them work to do. Hey, in addition to supporting the bill and thinking about this, I want you guys to get together and start working on the terms so that by the time we actually get to the agency that's going to be the gatekeeper of all of this data and make it open source to everyone, we're 80% down the road on the data catalog, because that's going to save us, 6 months. I'd ask the agency to start preparing an RFP to go out on the individuals who are going to do the vendors who are going to do the work for the portal, so that they can begin doing that. So they don't wait for the bill passes, hang out for 3 months and then write the RFP. And now that's another 6 months down the line. So I would try to cut, time off of it. And we're happy to provide some institutional experience for Wisconsin on how I think I would think about doing that. So I think about the implementation so that your vision will be implemented quicker.
And I also think that Measures for Justice, when I spoke with them the other day, they said that, starting off with a pilot too is also really helpful. If you can't, do the whole big picture, I think maybe starting small and then implementing it in increments might be helpful as well. So just depending on how your state is kind of organized.
Yeah, and we built that in. Chelsea's great to say about the pilot program. When we did our bill, we did both, right? So we said, all right, here's the bill that we're driving towards. But while we're doing that, we want these data fellows, and we put them in the 6th Circuit because it was my home circuit, so it was easy for me to talk to those people on a regular basis. But we put them in the circuit so that as we were developing all of this, we could develop, 2.0. What are the things that we're going to need to add to the bill and add to the data collection once we're operational, so that we weren't working on 2.0, a year down the road.
That's great.
One of the other things to keep in mind, I'm sorry to interrupt you, is, sometimes you spend a little money in order to see an investment on the back end. So I think that, one thing is there is a bit of a sticker value to it. It's nothing terribly shocking, but it does cost money. And those are things that, agencies and departments in the state have to think about of what their capabilities are and who could, perhaps host it or,
That was actually the next question I was going to ask. So you did include some money with the bill, and then I think an additional investment the next session, or perhaps that's?
Well, I think we're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million, at least 5 million in, probably a little more at this point, into doing everything that needed to be done. And it's not just the data collection portal, it's the uniform arrest affidavit to make sure that all of those things are similar, making sure that we were all kind of up to speed. The FBI had also had some additional requirements on fibers to bring us up to kind of the modern era, which we needed to do in order to make all of this data kind of work. So there were multiple pieces, some of which we would have had to do with or without the data bill. But we decided to include it with it, and then some we would have had to do, specifically because of the project that we're working on. But Chelsea's right. I mean, it is a financial investment, and it is a lot of money, certainly by normal people standards. When you're talking about $5 million, when you're talking about the magnitude of the criminal justice system and the impact that this information could have, it's pretty minor for what we could get out of it.
I'm monitoring questions in the chat, and there's one related to this, so I'll just ask it now. So there is a lot of support even among, and I'll just read it. There's a lot of support even among legislators to get better access to criminal justice data here in Wisconsin, but one significant roadblock is that it will take an investment with both money and personnel to do it. How did you make the case to your colleagues in the Florida legislature that this was a worthwhile investment?
Yeah, well, listen, I think that anybody who's in and around public policy, certainly someone who puts their name on a ballot, has to be able to tell people that public safety is a priority for them. I've always often said that it is the reason that government was created. Lots of other things have been included along the way, but the reason that government was created was to create, rules of the game. You can't go hurt your neighbor and not be held accountable. You can't go steal from your neighbor and not be held accountable. There has to be rules in the justice system. So this is the starting point for government. So if there's certainly a priority, this is one of them, and making sure that we do it right. And I think you're going to get people, both Republicans and Democrats, to buy into that vision. Chelsea mentioned this earlier, and I think it's worth noting again. Everybody thinks the data collection is going to validate their worldview, which is helpful. So lean into that, right? Hey, listen, I know you have a philosophy here. It may be the same as mine. It might be different, but guess what? Let's put all of our cards face up on the table. And then that way we might still see it differently. And I used the music analogy earlier because people play music a lot differently. As Dr. Seuss says, I sing high, he sings low, that kind of thing. But then let's do it. Then let's have that. But we have to have a starting point. I think that starting point is having the right information. So I think that you'll be able to buy people in across a political spectrum. I don't want to say easily, it's going to take work. But I think you'll be able to make that case on this pretty effectively.
And I think now more than ever, with everything that's gone on the past year, yesterday, I think now more than ever, we need to be taking a look at our criminal justice system and how we're functioning. And I think that this is a perfect stepping stone of kind of dipping your toes into the water of addressing a lot of these big issues.
There's also one other related question. Was there funding what funding was allocated to support local jurisdictions to carry out the process or provide data? Or I guess more broadly, where did the funding go?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to, in this case, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which was the hub that we used to pump the data in. So they got a lot of it, obviously, because they're hiring the vendors, they're doing the RFPs. From the rest of them, as I mentioned, before, a lot of these locals who were doing a lot of great work really didn't receive much. Now, we do fund some of them in the state budget, so I'm not pretending that there's not a hook there. There is a hook. But they really did a lot of it, inside existing resources. Again, understanding that the vision for the system was greater than the immediate impact that it would have, and they dedicated personnel in order to do this collection and really kind of buy in to a long-term vision. And I don't know about Wisconsin, but one of the things that we haven't done well historically as a state, which is reflected, I think, statewide, is we have jurisdictions who have different software systems for data collection, and they're all a lot of them are legacy systems. They've cost millions and millions of dollars to the taxpayers. They don't do a great job necessarily of talking to each other in one voice, which makes data collection a lot easier, as you know. So I think that they understood, based on our experiences here in Florida, the issues that we face, and wanted to be part of the problem solving. So I would just say to you, lean into them a little bit. Some of them are going to be not happy about having to do the work. There's no question about that. But I can tell you this, they are fully bought in to the project that we've done in Florida, even the ones who are very reticent because of the work workload. They are fully bought in. They have confidence that it's going to be done correctly, and they have big confidence that it's going to be beneficial to us in the long term.
Speaker, I know you, prior to being a legislator, you were a prosecutor. Talk a little bit about how your personal experience led you to, or influenced your perspective on this bill, I guess. I read an op-ed that you wrote, I think last year, that talked a little bit about that. And I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, listen, I mean, when I was a prosecutor, a mentor of mine who just passed away, Bernie McCabe, who was our state attorney, would always say to us, hey, what's the right thing to do? Go find the truth. And then once you've found the truth, figure out what the right thing to do is with that information. And that's really what this was about, right? The criminal justice the criminal justice system is something I care about both as a lawmaker, as a citizen, and I care about personally. It's something I've dedicated a significant part of my professional life to doing. So getting it right and finding the truth is very, very important to me. And look, that's harder than we make it out to be. It's easy to say, let's find the right information, but it really takes a lot of work. So when we were having these conversations about criminal justice, all of which, I think are really important, I wanted to have the right information so that we can really begin to reverse engineer some of these policies. Start with the policy idea and then say, okay, well, what does the data tell us about that, and how that will impact the state, positively or negatively. And in order to do that, we needed the information. And I think that there have been some who I think wanted to do more before some of the data come back, and I've been reluctant to do that because I want the information first. No differently than when I prosecuted a case. When I prosecuted a case, I didn't charge someone with a crime prior to having the witness testimony and the evidence and the things that I felt significantly, made sure that I had a good faith basis to believe that this person had committed that crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So, while we don't use a reasonable doubt standard in the Florida legislature for public policy, I certainly want to have a good starting point.
Yeah, well, I have plenty more questions, but we're getting them rolling now. So I will start asking some from our audience members. This one might be good for you, Chelsea. Did groups on the left and right work together? And talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely think this was an easy bill compared to a lot of other ones for folks to get behind. There really wasn't much pushback. I think that folks wanted more and wanted more to come through and be passed. But I think that this time we realized that this was something that needed to be addressed. We have the appetite for that. And we were also just trying to be realistic. So I think that sometimes it's better to get something done than nothing done at all. And I think that not only was this is something that's going to be useful for years and years to come. And I think that we'll all be able to benefit from it.
Another question in the Q&A. Congrats on a wonderful, impactful achievement. Were there any federal resources or partners that helped inform or shape the bill as you were drafting it?
I would say national groups, right? We mentioned some of them. Certainly Chelsea's group at Right on Crime, AFP, Measures for Justice. A lot of those groups were very helpful. No federal partners in the government sense, really. Number one, the federal justice system is radically different than what we have in Florida. Like not even close, right? It is apples and automobiles on how they do things federally versus how we do things in the state. So that conversation is not one that a lot of times makes sense when people are talking about things federally and think, hey, this applies to your state. It really doesn't most of the time because our data, our information, our justice system is very, very different from what they're doing federally and what they're pursuing federally. But I don't know how that is in other states and what that looks like. So we didn't really have a lot of contact with the federal government about the data. We did speak to the FBI several times about some of the databases that they have and what those databases collect information on and how we were updating ours to make sure that as they move forward in their data collection, we wanted to be able to, when all of that information goes to our hub, to be able to pump whatever relevant information, to the FBI so that we're all kind of on the same page. But that was really the extent of the information. They weren't really weighing in on any of the policy items.
Okay.
And one thing I'll mention, Julie, because I think this is really important in the bill is as you look through and you'll see kind of things you would expect, right? So, you'll see, we're going to collect the person's date of birth and, all of these kinds of things. One of the things that was really important to me personally was collecting information on the victim. of the crime. When we talk about criminal justice policy, so often it is focused solely on the defendant. Who's the defendant? How long is the defendant serving? For what crime? All of these kinds of things, which are all really important. But who is the victim of that crime? Where were they? What was how were they victimized? All of those kinds of things are really important. And when we have conversations that are really totally one-sided and are about the criminal defendant and not about the victim included in that story, we're not even beginning to tell, the whole story as to what's happening. So, one of the things I would make sure as you go through that data collection, and I really do think that the bill that we have is really good at laying a lot of those items out. But one of the ones most important that I think could have gotten missed is who's the victim.
And I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. My husband was just getting out of surgery and that was the doctor calling, but we're all good. Sorry.
Great news. No worries. Following up on that question, Speaker, there is a question in the chat. I'm just curious myself. Can you talk about some of the other data points that's the bill requires to be collected? I know it starts all the way from arrest to release. I mean, it's substantive. Any other ones that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, it's really everything that you would think of, but it's also going to be things like violations of probation, right? So, I look at something, I'll give you something that we talk about a lot, right? So, and I'll probably be off a little bit on the numbers, so forgive me. It's been, 6 months, a year since I've probably looked at them fresh, but, you take drug offenders, for example, right? I think roughly 3 or 4%, probably 4% of people in the Department of Corrections in Florida are there for drug crimes that are not drug trafficking. So drug possession, right? So we have those 4%. It's not an easy thing to go to prison in the state of Florida for a drug possession crime, right? So now I want to know about those people, like what's their experience been like with the criminal justice system? Were they in drug treatment court? Did it work? Did it not work? Did they never go to drug treatment court? Why didn't they go there? Were they not sent there? Or did they not want to go? What's the reason? And we've seen some really interesting policy choices there. And I actually wanted to at one point, not to digress, Julie, but I said to myself, well, look, if we know that somebody who goes to veterans or drug treatment court, if they graduate, I think it's like 80% of them have not reoffended within 5 years. Those are the best numbers for recidivism in the criminal justice system, right? So it's like, how do I replicate that over and over and over again? And I wanted to say, well, what if I make the criminal defendant, when they first get charged for their first felony drug crime, possession of cocaine, make them go to a treatment court. Don't give them an option of regular probation or those kinds of things. And it was really the judges, interestingly enough, who are on the front lines of those treatment courts who came to me and said, hey, don't do that. They need to want to come if we're going to be successful. And, and I was discouraged by that because I wanted the instant gratification of, changing the system quicker. But they're probably right. So we didn't do that. But I think you have to have that information. So we're going to find out how many times did they violate probation, and figure out how is it that this person who, was in no way in a position when they got their first, possession of cocaine or even like their 10th possession of cocaine, probably headed to prison. How did they get there? Did they violate probation? Where was that breakdown and so forth? So all of that data collection really begins to tell a story about one particular defendant. And to the extent that there are commonalities among a class or a group of particular defendants, that's, I think, where we get to really have, enlightened public policy discussions.
And the bill does require the measure of, this is a big discussion in Wisconsin, that's just why I'm asking, reason for violating probation. Correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think it's those are big deal things, right? Like, did you violate probation because you got a positive, urine analysis for marijuana, or did you violate probation because you committed a new crime? I think we'll probably agree that those are significantly different things. Mm-hmm. And we've done things in Florida based on that policy discussion already, where we've said, hey, if you have what I would consider, and I think what most people consider in Florida, a technical violation, which would include, you pop positive for marijuana, you were out past curfew, you did something stupid, you're not necessarily doing anything bad. And, we've taken those individuals and made it easier for judges administratively to reinstate them on probation, as opposed to having a big court hearing and taking up all the resources involved in that. So I think it's really important that you figure out why they violated probation, because I do think that's going to make a significant difference.
Mm-hmm.
And also on the flip side, I think it'll be interesting to see, who's actually, taking pleas, if we're understanding if folks are actually taking the plea or if they're going straight to trial. I think that'll be also interesting to look at too. Now, not everyone has great state attorneys like yours.
Question for you both. Any opposition to the bill? And if so, where did that come from, or how did you address it?
Gosh, Chelsea's memory might be better than mine on this. I don't remember strong opposition. I think that the biggest opposition was the volume of work that took place in order to get this done. I mean, this was not we're changing the state bird, here it is, we're changing this line to this line. And it was not that, it was complicated. It was hard. It wasn't something that we had any institutional knowledge over where, we've been in the school choice fight for 25 years in the legislature. We understand the moving pieces to it. This was something totally new to us, which is why we had reached out to friends like Chelsea and to Measures for Justice and AFP and others who were interested in this topic to get their expertise and their advice, and really built that in to trying to do the work very quickly. Thank goodness for the taxpayers. We're not a year-round legislature, but it does mean we have a shorter period of time to achieve whatever end that we had. So we were able to do all of that work in a relatively condensed period of time, because we brought those people in. But so it wasn't really opposition so much as it was, getting uphill as quickly as you can.
Yeah, I think that nobody really wanted to have to take on that enormous task. So I think that a lot of folks, it was just kind of, understanding where is it going to go? Where is it going to be housed? We have some really archaic systems at FDLE. So I think that was probably not opposition, but it was a little, there's just going to be a lot of work coming. So I don't think anybody was ever opposed to having more sunshine in the Sunshine State. So.
We have a somewhat related question in the chat. Did you encounter any resistance from the judiciary regarding the collection of sentencing data? And if so, how did you respond to that?
No institutional opposition. I think it was more questions. How are we going to do this? How is it going to be uniform? I mean, sometimes it can feel like a death by 1,000 cuts, in this case, death by 1,000 questions. But they're necessary questions. I do think that there are things, going back to the data collection as it impacts the judiciary. We do a thing at sentencing, which you may do in Wisconsin as well, which is we have what we call a sentencing score sheet. Everyone's prior record, and then there's numbers associated with each charge, et cetera. Well, you're supposed to, when it was all hard copy when I was there, but you rip it off, there's multiple copies, you give one to the judge, one goes to the clerk, et cetera. Well, in some counties, like in my county, you had, 98, 99% of those sentencing score sheets made the trip from, that place to Tallahassee to the Department of Corrections. There were other jurisdictions where, 50% made it. That's a problem, right? Especially when there are large metropolitan areas, in the state. So I think the judges were concerned about those discrepancies and how do we fix them, which is where we came to the uniform rest affidavit and all of those kinds of things to make sure that everybody's, operating off the same forms so that when they submit those forms, they're much easier to deal with and input the data.
Great. Another question from the chat that I will just read. Data linking has been a real challenge in many places. Pride of authorship seems to stand in the way of simple things like creating a shared or unique identifier to link person-level info. Without funding, how do you bring along these agencies or authors who need to rejigger their systems to match the definitions that they did not create?
Well, you tell them that you want them to be part of it. You get their input on the front end, and then you pass a bill that makes them do it. And that's what we did. I mean, I hate to say that, but that is what we're here to do. And these individuals are, carrying out justice on behalf of the people of the state of Florida. When I appeared in front of juries, I always said, I'm Chris Sprowls here representing the people of the state of Florida. That's what we do. So that means that we have to make sure we're getting on the front end of these policy conversations. And the only way to do this is to get the information. So when I said to those individuals, I get it. I want to do it right. I want you to help me. I know it's going to be hard. I'm here to help you to the extent that we can, but we need you to do this. And by the way, the law says we need you to do this. And I think if my memory doesn't serve me correctly, we did have some fairly strong language by our standards in the bill that basically said, if you don't do this, here are the consequences. and we've never had to use it. We've never even talked about using it because it hasn't been necessary because someone else, everyone's done such a great job. But I can tell you, Julie, that when we rolled that out, it was a bit of a shock to the system that there was a built-in consequence for not transmitting the data and leaning in.
So let's talk a little bit about, there's another question in the chat, but let's talk a little bit about the implementation, which I know you said was perhaps more difficult than passing the actual bill itself. How long did it take to go from the beginning of having a working hub to having useful data, which I know that, you said a little bit delayed because there's just a lot of work behind all of this. Can you just talk about what the implementation looks like? And, I know the goals have shifted, but what are the goals right now?
Yeah, well, I won't bore everyone with every detail because it would be voluminous and we'd run out of time. But listen, from everything from the you mentioned earlier, the data catalog, the data collection, the terms, making sure that people agree on the terms, promulgating the terms, getting out the RFP, that took significant time and more time than I cared for and more time than I would have liked. What I would say to you is, at least for us, the local sheriffs, the local clerks, and so forth, really did an amazing job. Where I would focus, to the extent that your situation is similar to ours, if you feel like your locals are going to be able to do this pretty quickly, I would focus on the implementing state agency and say, okay, what are your timelines? Are you meeting the timelines? I think it's something where on implementation as something as robust as this, and I've had a similar experience. I did a healthcare data transparency bill several years, before that, and that took a long time to implement. We talk about, I feel like we built interstates, quicker than it takes to do some of the data roadways and the data interstates that we've created. But there's significant projects, and I think I didn't have an appreciation for that at the beginning as to how difficult it was going to be. So I think doing that work on the front end is really, really important, and pushing that state agency, giving them timelines. And I really think that you're going to need either the sponsor, either the legislator or a staff member, to be on really weekly calls and data and checks on what's the status, what's the problem, so that you're getting the information quicker. There was times where there were some lags where I didn't know for 2 or 3 weeks that there was a slowdown. Then I had to double back and say, what's the slowdown? How do I fix it? So I do think it's going to take some work. And after you pass the bill, to the extent there's legislators on the call are going to see this, after you pass the bill in your state, the real work begins.
And two other aspects about the bill that I just want to point out that I don't think have been touched on, and maybe they were just obvious to you, but are really admirable, is the fact that it requires these agencies to report on a regular basis. I think it's either monthly or every 2 weeks. And then the bill also requires that all of this data is put together in an easily accessible way so that the public can eventually go to a website and search. Those are 2 points that I just wanted to note, because it's something that we look for in Wisconsin all the time.
Sure. No, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I think on the open source part, right, I didn't want to do anything that wasn't going to be open source and available to everyone, right? If you need a decoder ring or a government password, to get access to the information, then it's pointless, because it's going to be the outside groups, or it's going to be the outside researchers, or, a 15-year-old kid with his computer who's going to really probably end up giving us the most insightful information about what this data really means. And that means it needs to be available and freedom for everybody. On the second part, as far as, the timeliness of the reporting, look, I mean, I don't want to be making choices on data that's, 18 months old and realize that for some reason, it's changed. I mean, look at the violent crime rates in some areas of the country right now. We're seeing violent crime rates spike in certain places. I don't want to wait 12 months to learn that, hey, homicide rates in my community are up. So we wanted to make sure that we were getting that very, very timely, so that the information people were using was being done. Also, the hard part is building the road, right? Once the road is built, you can drive on it a lot faster. And so what we've done is, we've built the roads from the local jurisdiction to the agency. Once that is built, there's really no excuse, not to be able to pump the information quicker.
We have a question in the chat. Are there any other states following your lead in passing similar data transparency laws? If so, have you seen meaningful improvements or extensions? I believe some states have begun the process or have tried to follow. Do either of you know anything on the status of that?
I think California is working on one or just passed one. I could be wrong on that, but I think Speaker would probably know more than me.
I know there were some states that were working on it. I think there was one or two who had done some kind of baby steps, maybe a year or so ago or a couple of years ago on it. But as far as I know, nobody has passed a bill yet that is as aggressive or robust as ours. Although we hope Wisconsin will be the first. But we're anxious to tell other people about it. I mean, I think ideally we end up in a situation, maybe it takes 5 years, maybe it takes 10, where, this is a 50-state situation. And imagine really what we could learn if you had, now we go from a big state like Florida where there's 22 million people. Imagine if that starts to expand across the nation and we really could, do a deep dive, not just on what's happening in criminal justice in Florida, but really what's happening, throughout the nation and break that down by geography and zip code and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think just in my research before this call, it looked like Colorado, California, like you mentioned, Chelsea, New York, North Carolina. A few states have tried, but to my knowledge, I don't think any have actually passed a bill that was as substantial as this one. How did you engage your local criminal justice coordinating councils during this process? That's another question.
We just, we asked them to come up here and, had conversations with them. I mean, we've got, various associations that usually represent the stakeholders. We've got a statewide clerks association, statewide public defenders, state attorneys, sheriffs, police chiefs. So usually it's pretty easy to push one button and get that group. And, and that's what we really did. We just brought them all in. And then as we've gone along in the implementation, when we've done stakeholder meetings, we made sure that there's a consistent representative of each one of those groups, to make sure that, everything's being done, from the local level up to the state level to transmit that information.
There's a question, how can the legislation be accessed? I can try to find it and put it in the chat.
Sure.
If that's helpful to everyone. Another question in the chat, can you describe the hub? I think you used that word, where all this information is collected and like, what is that going to look like?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier about how this data was everywhere, and I've mentioned who those stakeholders are. So what we did is we picked the Florida Department of Law Enforcement because it's our statewide law enforcement agency. So probably the equivalent of other states, state police, same idea. They also maintained our our NCIC, FCIC, our data, some of our data framework in criminal justice in the state. So we picked them as the entity that would house this information and be responsible for the promulgation of the rules and all those kinds of things. So when the data is being pumped, right, so from all these local jurisdictions throughout the state, it's being pumped to one portal. That portal is operated by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the vendor that they have, gone through out to bid in order to create that portal. So that when I say the hub, I really mean the portal, which is operated by our state law enforcement agency.
Okay, that's one, I think maybe last question, but I'll keep asking. The question is, what has been the most useful, surprising data that's been collected so far? I guess another way of asking that is, what are you most interested in getting the data back on?
Well, that's a good question. Chelsea might have a better one on that. I'm interested in all of it. I mean, I think one of the things is when you start looking at the vastness of the issues that come up in criminal justice, you tend to run down a rabbit hole one day and run down another rabbit hole the next, because it's really interesting to really kind of, grab that Rubik's Cube and start twisting it and figuring out, why is this working? Why is this not working? And some of the things you find tend to shock you and tend to surprise you. So I think all of it is helpful depending on what the problem is that day. And when I say that, I mean, I've had this range from, issues surrounding people who are in prison for really, really bad things doing life to a juvenile who's picked up on their first arrest ever. And all of us kind of agreeing, hey, it's a minor arrest. None of us want that to be something that follows them the rest of their life or causes them any kind of problems. So how do we deal with that individual? So I really think this is going to run the gamut of, problems from people who are probably never going to do anything again ever in their life to somebody who's going to be in prison for the rest of their life.
And And to echo the speaker, I think that there is an entire gamut of things that we could do. It's I think it's talking about pretrial, talking about once folks get out. I think that just to be able to look at everything from a large map, and I mean you could pick a silo one day and figure out an area that we need to have reform in. So I think that it's just going to be. I'm really excited to see it. So I think you guys will, and I think if we could get the whole country doing that, then we'd really be able to have no excuses for trying to fix the issues that we've got.
Well, that seems to be all the questions that we have. But I just want to see if either of you have any closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to add or say to all of us Wisconsinites on the call who are really interested in this issue. I guess we think that, we hope and we think that this will be a bipartisan issue in the state. I think like Speaker Sprowls said at the beginning, every person is kind of looking for the data to say something different. But if we can all agree that let's just see what it says, before we jump to those conclusions and legislate and reform based off of the data and not assumptions, seems to be a good place to start. So do either of you have anything else to add before we end today's call?
Chelsea, I'll let you go first. Anything?
No, I'll wait for my wheel of cheese. I've always wanted to go to Wisconsin, but no, I really appreciate you having me, and thank you, Speaker, for coming on too. And again, I think that also reaching out to folks like Measures for Justice and learning some of the data and what they've been able to do is also really helpful. There's tons of resources out there, so feel free to.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say two things. One, the Florida House is at your service to the extent that we can give you information and help you as you do this. We do think it's really important for our state, probably very important for your state. And the second thing I would say, because I have to do this a lot, is time is finite, so you have to pick the issues that you feel like are really worth you diving into and spending a lot of time on. And I have spent a lot of time on this issue, and what I would tell you is it is worth it. This is something that is important enough to spend the time, and I promise you that it will be frustrating along the way. But I also promise that I think it's something that will truly have a radical impact on, in a good way, on your state and on your criminal justice policy conversations.
I put the bill text in the chat as well as my email, which is julie@badgerinstitute.org. If anyone has any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you both again, Speaker Sprowls and Chelsea. It's been so great to have you here. We will keep you updated if anything progresses here in Wisconsin, but it certainly always helps to learn from other states that have accomplished something this substantial. So with that being said, I guess everyone will end a little bit early here today. Thank you to everyone on the call for joining us for our Badger Institute Symposium series. And like I said, let me know if you have any follow-up questions.